The first-class encounter. Ethan Brooks settled into the plush leather seat of Skylux Air's first-class cabin, but something about the moment felt distant, almost foreign to him. The seat itself, surrounded by the quiet hum of the cabin as the other passengers settled in, wasn't new to him. He had flown first class many times before, attending high-stakes meetings, forging partnerships, and closing business deals. But today, something was different. This time, he wasn't a high-profile CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company. Today, Ethan was a man traveling incognito, seeking to understand the inner workings of the company he had recently purchased. Skylux Air was now part of his portfolio, and he intended to learn everything there was to know about it. But in this moment, dressed in a simple navy hoodie, his presence felt out of place in the sleek, high-end environment that was Skylux Air's flagship service. The flight attendant who had greeted him earlier, her smile a mask of polished professionalism, had been welcoming but slightly distracted. Ethan observed her as she moved through the cabin, delivering routine pleasantries to other passengers. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the decor or the elite atmosphere that felt out of reach. It was the way he, dressed so simply, seemed to blend into the background. He had never considered himself a flashy person. His success had always been built on hard work, ingenuity, and being in the right place at the right time. He wasn't one for wearing designer suits or boasting about his accomplishments. Instead, he preferred the subtle power of simplicity, something he knew had helped him build his empire without ever drawing unnecessary attention to himself. But today, it seemed that simplicity was working against him. As the plane taxied to the runway, Ethan kept to himself, watching as the other passengers talked amongst themselves, drank champagne, and scanned through the glossy travel magazines that Skylux Air provided. There was a calm hum of conversation, a polite but empty exchange that felt more like a ritual than a genuine connection. It was then that the tension first began to creep in. "Excuse me, sir," a firm voice broke through Ethan's thoughts. He looked up and met the sharp, assessing gaze of the flight attendant, Lisa Carter. She was a senior member of the crew, her blonde hair tightly pulled into a bun, her uniform crisp and immaculate. Her eyes scanned him briefly, taking in his worn sneakers and hoodie with the kind of judgment he had come to expect from high society. She didn't even try to hide the disapproval that flickered in her eyes as she asked the question he had already begun to dread. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Lisa's tone was cold, professional but with a sharp edge, as though she expected a different answer. Ethan raised an eyebrow, confused but not willing to be intimidated. "Yes, I'm sure. Can I help you with something?" Lisa's lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes scanning the boarding pass Ethan handed her with forced politeness. It took only a moment for her to glance down at the ticket, and her frown deepened as if she had found something hidden in the fine print that didn't sit right with her. "This is a first-class ticket," she said flatly, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "How did you obtain it?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the bluntness of her question. "I booked it, just like everyone else." Lisa's posture stiffened, as though his response had offended her in some way. "Sir, I'm going to ask you again. Are you sure you belong here?" Ethan took a deep breath, trying to remain composed despite the mounting tension. The other passengers had begun to notice the exchange, their eyes flickering between him and Lisa with curiosity and perhaps judgment. He could sense the shift in the cabin's energy as whispers started to ripple through the air. This wasn't just an interrogation anymore. It was becoming a spectacle, a public display of scrutiny. "I'm not sure what the problem is," Ethan said, his voice firm but calm. "This is my seat, and I'm staying here." Lisa's eyes narrowed, and a cold, rehearsed smile appeared on her face, as though her professional mask was slipping, revealing the frustration underneath. "It's just unusual to see someone traveling in first class dressed like this," she said, her voice tinged with barely veiled distaste. Ethan felt the heat of humiliation rise up his neck, but he refused to let it show. He knew this was more than just an issue of attire. It was an issue of perception, of class and expectations, and he wasn't going to let Lisa's judgment define him. "I wasn't aware there was a dress code," he replied, his voice level, his eyes meeting hers with quiet defiance. Lisa's expression hardened, and she quickly backpedaled. "Of course not," she said, her tone defensive. "But we do like to maintain a certain standard for our first-class passengers." Ethan's fists clenched, though he kept them out of sight. He could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on him now, the subtle shift in their judgment. The murmurs had already begun, and though he remained outwardly calm, inside, he felt a simmering frustration rise up in him. This wasn't about him being profiled. It was about a larger issue that extended beyond this moment, beyond this flight. This was about how people like him, people who didn't fit the mold, were often made to feel unwelcome, unwarranted, and invisible in spaces they had every right to be. "I see," Ethan said quietly, leaning back into his seat, unwilling to let the situation escalate any further. "But I'm staying right here." Without another word, Lisa straightened up and walked away, her polished demeanor intact, but her steps stiff with barely contained irritation. She returned moments later with the flight supervisor, Daniel, a middle-aged man with graying hair who wore the same stiff professional mask as Lisa. He introduced himself with a rehearsed smile, his voice dripping with politeness. "We just want to ensure everything is in order before takeoff," Daniel said. "There's been some confusion about your seating." Ethan shook his head, his patience starting to fray. "There's no confusion. I've shown you my boarding pass. It's valid. I'm in my assigned seat." Lisa, standing behind Daniel, chimed in sharply. "He's being uncooperative," she said, her tone accusing. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "Uncooperative? For sitting in the seat I paid for?" Daniel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the growing tension. Ethan could sense that the eyes of every passenger were on him now, the atmosphere in the cabin thick with judgment. A few passengers whispered among themselves, no doubt discussing the disruption, and Ethan couldn't help but feel that his presence, his very being, was somehow becoming a spectacle for everyone else to witness. "Perhaps we could move you to another seat," Daniel suggested, his tone soft, almost apologetic. Ethan stared at him, incredulous. "You want me to leave first class?" Before Daniel could respond, Lisa spoke again, her voice sharp. "Because this section is reserved for passengers who meet certain expectations." There it was, the euphemism that cut deeper than any outright insult could. Ethan knew exactly what she meant, and it stung. The message was clear. People like him, people who didn't fit the prescribed mold of a first-class passenger, weren't welcome. He glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of the other passengers, each of them a mirror reflecting some form of judgment or curiosity. "I'll tell you what," Ethan said slowly, his voice steady, even as his frustration simmered beneath the surface. "I'll stay right here in my assigned seat, and when we land in New York, we'll have a conversation about expectations. Yours and mine." Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the subtle authority in his tone. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but nodded, signaling an end to the confrontation. The rest of the flight continued without further incident, but the moment lingered in the back of Ethan's mind. He had just been humiliated, his presence questioned by a flight attendant who thought she had the right to police who belonged in first class. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked, the subtle biases that ran deep in the fabric of Skylux Air. As the plane ascended into the sky, Ethan's resolve solidified. This was no longer just a flight to New York. This was a journey to fix what was broken in Skylux Air, starting with the deeply ingrained prejudices that had led to his treatment today. The moment he had experienced wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern that needed to be addressed, and Ethan was going to make sure it would be. The turning point. The flight pressed on, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to Ethan's thoughts. The glare of the overhead lights seemed more intense now, casting a cold glow over the cabin as the sky outside darkened with the approach of evening. He leaned back in his seat, trying to relax, but the events of the last hour were like an iron weight pressing against his chest. The feeling of being othered, the way Lisa had questioned his right to be in first class, it wasn't just about the moment itself. It was about something deeper, something systemic. This wasn't an isolated encounter. It was a symptom of a culture that had been allowed to fester, unchallenged, for far too long. Ethan had been through much worse in his life. He had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunities seemed as distant as the stars, where every step he took forward was met with 3 steps back. He had fought for everything he had ever achieved, and he knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be the underdog. But this was different. This was a company that had the potential to do so much better. A company that, under his leadership, could become a model of inclusivity and respect. And yet, here he was, sitting in first class, being treated as though he didn't belong simply because of his casual attire. It wasn't just about the flight attendants. It wasn't just about Lisa's condescending attitude. This was bigger than that. This was about an institution where people, whether passengers or employees, could be judged by superficial metrics that had no real bearing on their worth. It was about an ingrained elitism that valued appearances over substance, and Ethan wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. He glanced around the cabin, observing the other passengers once more. The couple at the far end of the aisle were laughing softly, their voices mingling with the sound of clinking glass as they sipped their champagne. They looked the part, well-dressed, affluent, at ease in this luxurious environment. To them, first class was a given, a space where only those who fit a certain image were allowed to exist without question. Ethan could almost hear the unspoken thoughts passing between them as they glanced in his direction. What does he think he's doing here? The woman might have wondered. He doesn't belong in first class, the man likely mused. Their eyes lingered on him for a moment, but as quickly as they noticed, they returned to their drinks and their conversation. It was subtle, but it was there. The judgment. And then there was the middle-aged man beside him, the one who had been leafing through the travel magazine. Ethan noticed him glance up from time to time, his eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together some mystery. Ethan met his gaze once, but the man quickly looked away, his discomfort palpable. He didn't know how to place Ethan either. Too casually dressed for someone sitting in this section. Too ordinary, perhaps. Ethan let out a slow breath, turning his attention back to the window. He could see his reflection in the glass, the faint outline of his face framed by the darkening sky. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. He saw a young entrepreneur, a boy who had once been told he didn't belong anywhere, a young man who had fought tooth and nail to prove that he was worthy of respect. He had risen above the obstacles thrown in his path. He had built his career on hard work and tenacity, defying every expectation others had for him. Yet here he was, reduced to nothing more than a spectacle, a point of ridicule in the eyes of those who didn't understand his journey. The longer Ethan sat there, the more he realized that this wasn't just about him. This was about a culture that needed to change. Skyluxair wasn't just a company, it was a reflection of the world he lived in, a world where appearances often trumped ability, and where those who didn't fit the mold were made to feel as though they didn't belong. It was time for that to end. He wasn't just going to let this moment pass by. He had to do something. He reached for the glass of water that had been left on his tray. But before he could take a sip, the sound of heels clicking against the aisle broke his concentration. Lisa was back, her expression even colder than before. She had returned with the usual air of forced politeness, but this time, there was a tension in her demeanor, something almost fragile in the way she approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clipped. "I'd brought you this," she said, placing a tray with a small plate of nuts in front of him. Her eyes briefly flicked to his outfit before she straightened up again, her lips forming a tight smile. "It's complimentary." Ethan glanced at the tray. The nuts were perfectly arranged, though something about the gesture felt empty. The effort seemed half-hearted, as if she was merely going through the motions without any real desire to make him feel welcome. "Thank you," Ethan replied, his voice measured but laced with a subtle edge. Lisa's eyes narrowed imperceptibly, as though she were searching for something in his tone, something that might give her an excuse to further engage with him. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they stood in an uneasy silence. Then, as if she had found the answer she was looking for, Lisa stepped back, but not before giving him one last look. Her eyes lingered, almost searching for a reaction, for something to confirm the distance she had already placed between them. As she moved away, Ethan's mind raced. The moment had been brief, but it had confirmed everything he had suspected. Lisa's behavior wasn't just an anomaly. It was part of a larger issue. It wasn't just her bias. It was the systemic issue that ran through Skylux Air, the unspoken rules that divided people into categories based on how they looked, what they wore, and how they behaved. Ethan's gaze drifted across the cabin once more, and this time, his eyes locked with the older man in the seat beside him, the one with the travel magazine. The man was looking at him again, his gaze more direct this time, and there was something different in his eyes, something almost apologetic. "I saw what happened earlier," the man said softly, leaning slightly toward Ethan. "That was unnecessary." Ethan was momentarily taken aback. He had expected indifference, perhaps even more judgment, but not this. The man's tone was sincere, his words kind. Ethan nodded, but he didn't speak right away. There wasn't much to say. He had already processed the discomfort, the tension. It was just one more example of how deeply ingrained these biases were. "It happens," Ethan said simply, offering a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. The man didn't seem satisfied with that response. He shook his head, looking at Ethan with quiet disapproval. "It shouldn't. You have every right to be here. Don't let them make you feel otherwise." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if the man's words were an attempt to console him, or simply an acknowledgement of the injustice. Either way, it was too little too late. The damage had been done. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin seemed to ebb and flow. Lisa, for her part, kept her distance, but it was clear that she had not forgotten the earlier exchange. Every time she passed by, her gaze lingered just a little too long, as if trying to catch him in a moment of vulnerability. But Ethan refused to let her win. He kept his eyes forward, his posture relaxed, and his mind focused on the task at hand. He wasn't here for her approval. He was here to see things for himself, to understand the culture within Skylux Air. When the meal service began, Ethan noticed the shift immediately. Lisa, as expected, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a younger flight attendant, Katie, approached his row. Katie's demeanor was a stark contrast to Liz's. It was warm, genuine, and refreshingly kind. "Would you like cheesecake or fruit tarts?" Katie asked, her smile inviting. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Cheesecake, please." Katie's eyes sparkled as she placed the dessert in front of him, her tone soft and professional. "If you need anything else, just let me know. We're here to make your flight enjoyable." Ethan couldn't help but smile in return. The difference between her and Lisa was striking. While Lisa had treated him like an inconvenience, Katie made him feel like a valued guest. For a brief moment, it reminded him of why he had come here in the first place, to ensure that Skylux Air could foster an environment where everyone felt welcome, no matter who they were or what they wore. As the flight progressed, Ethan found himself thinking more and more about his purpose. This wasn't just about him being treated unfairly. It was about the company as a whole, about changing the culture that had allowed this kind of behavior to go unnoticed for so long. There were bigger things at play, and he was determined to fix them. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a man on a mission, and he was ready to fight for the change Skylux Air so desperately needed. The unspoken system. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign coming on jolted Ethan back to the present. His thoughts had been wandering, Still caught in the lingering aftermath of his interaction with Lisa and reflecting on how the culture at Skylux Air needed a deep overhaul. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the cabin had once again settled into a quiet rhythm. Passengers shifted in their seats, some dozing off, others flipping through magazines or staring out the windows, while the gentle hum of the engines provided a calming soundtrack to the flight. For a moment, Ethan thought he might be able to escape the nagging feeling of discomfort that had plagued him ever since he had boarded Skylux's flagship flight. But as the hours ticked by, the weight of what had happened kept creeping into his mind. It wasn't just about the minor personal indignity he had suffered. It was the pervasive atmosphere of superiority that seemed to hang in the air, an invisible wall that divided those in first class from those outside of it. The behavior Lisa had displayed was a direct reflection of that culture, one that prioritized appearance and status over substance, one that subtly and overtly made it clear who was worthy of the premium experience and who wasn't. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his gaze once again drifting to the window. The sprawling landscape beneath him appeared distant, almost surreal. It felt like a metaphor for his current predicament. Here he was, hovering above everything, looking at the world from a place of power and success, but still seeing through a glass, a lens that distorted reality and made it difficult to connect with the people he was now surrounded by. As the flight wore on, the cabin service began in earnest. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering drinks, refilling glasses, and ensuring that the experience remained as seamless as possible. Ethan's observations remained sharp as he scrutinized every action, every glance exchanged between passengers and crew. It was as though he were watching a performance, each movement choreographed to perfection, but beneath the surface, something felt deeply wrong. He was witnessing an elaborate facade, polished, curated, and staged, but one that lacked any real authenticity or humanity. Then came the meal service. Ethan had opted for salmon, and the tray arrived with the customary precision. The glass of wine, the small dish of salad, and the neatly arranged serving of fish. But as the flight attendants set the trays down, Ethan noticed the difference. His meal wasn't quite right. His salmon was slightly overcooked, the garnishes slightly off-center. The attention to detail wasn't what he had seen when the other passengers were served. It was as though his meal had been treated with less care, as if the simple act of preparing it had been done with less thought, less precision. A quiet tension settled over him, a flicker of realization igniting within his chest. This wasn't just about the way he was being treated by a single flight attendant. It was about the subtle, often unnoticed biases that existed within the company as a whole. If Lisa could treat him with such disdain, what were the chances that the other employees weren't perpetuating similar biases? How many other passengers had been treated unfairly simply because they didn't conform to the idealized image of who belonged in first class? How many employees, despite being loyal and hardworking, had been overlooked, dismissed, or ignored because they didn't fit a certain mold? Ethan's gaze swept over the cabin again, this time with a different understanding. He no longer saw the passengers as mere strangers. He saw them as part of a system. They were all participants in a game that was rigged from the start. The couple at the far end of the cabin, the man with the travel magazine, the passengers on either side of him. They were all unknowingly playing roles in this silent, unspoken hierarchy. And while the system may have worked for those who fit its expectations, it was profoundly damaging to everyone else. What about the employees? What about the ones who didn't meet the physical expectations of a first-class passenger? What about the people who were simply doing their jobs with dedication and integrity, but found themselves dismissed simply because they didn't conform to the company's skewed definition of proper? Ethan realized that the problem wasn't confined to the passengers, or even to a single employee. It was pervasive, infecting every level of Skylux Air. It had become a part of the company's DNA, and it was going to take more than a few well-meaning words to fix it. It would take a cultural revolution. The rest of the meal service passed without incident, but Ethan's mind was far from at ease. His food, while passable, tasted bland, the dissonance between his thoughts and the meal before him growing more pronounced. He picked at his salmon, his thoughts racing, his mind churning with ideas of what needed to change. Skylux Air had the potential to be a leader in its industry, a beacon of hospitality, equality, and respect for all. But right now, it was a company drowning in its own elitism. When the dessert cart came around, Ethan noticed another subtle contrast. Lisa wasn't the one pushing it. Instead, a younger flight attendant named Katie approached his row, her smile genuinely warm, her eyes meeting his with kindness and recognition. There was no coldness in her demeanor, no invisible barrier between them. She was simply doing her job, but it felt worlds apart from how Lisa had treated him. "Would you like cheesecake or fruit tart, sir?" Katie asked, her voice soft and unassuming. "Cheesecake, please," Ethan replied, appreciating her kindness, even if it was an echo of what was missing earlier. Katie placed the dessert on his tray, the small gesture of care making him feel just a little more at ease. "If there's anything else I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask. We're here for you." Her words were simple, but there was no agenda behind them. It wasn't an act. It was genuine care. She had no ulterior motive. And for that, Ethan found himself nodding in appreciation. Her kindness served as a sharp contrast to Lisa's cold, calculated professionalism. But as the flight continued, Ethan's mind returned to his observations. Katie was, of course, the exception. The truth was, he had seen more of Lisa's kind than he had of Katie. It was that ingrained bias, that preference for people who looked and acted a certain way, that ran rampant through the ranks of Skylux Air. Ethan had spent years cultivating a leadership style that was based on merit, not appearances. When he had founded his company, he had made sure to hire people from diverse backgrounds, ensuring that their voices were heard and that they had the chance to succeed based on their abilities, rather than how they looked or how much they fit the expected mold. It had been a cornerstone of his success, and yet, here he was, seeing firsthand how a company as established as Skylux had failed to grasp such basic principles. The thought gnawed at him. The legacy of the airline's culture was so deeply embedded that it couldn't be fixed by simply reprimanding one employee or passing a few new rules. It was going to require a fundamental shift, a reframing of what was acceptable and what wasn't. A company could no longer afford to operate on the assumptions of the past. Skylux, under his leadership, would become a place where everyone was welcomed with dignity, regardless of their race, their attire, or their background. But the task ahead wasn't going to be easy. The biases Ethan had seen in Lisa weren't just isolated incidents. They were reflections of a larger issue. And it would take more than just one conversation, or even one sweeping change to fix that. Ethan knew he had a long road ahead of him. The company's leadership would need to be transformed. But first, the employees would need to be shown what kind of company they were meant to be working for, one that recognized their value, no matter their appearance. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the meeting that awaited him when the plane touched down in New York. The moment of discomfort he had felt during the exchange with Lisa wasn't just a personal affront. It was a catalyst. Skylux Air was about to undergo a transformation, and Ethan was determined to make it happen. The groundwork had already been laid. The company had the potential to become a force for good in the airline industry, one that led by example. As the plane began its descent into JFK, the lights of New York twinkled below, the skyline a glittering backdrop to the weighty task ahead. Ethan's mind was already in motion, preparing for the steps he needed to take to make Skylux Air a company that lived up to its potential. No more elitism, no more biases. The time for change had come, and Ethan was ready to see it through, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The deepening resolve. The descent into New York was smooth, but as the plane lowered into the night sky, the weight of Ethan's thoughts grew heavier. The lights of the city below seemed to beckon him, a silent reminder of the path ahead. They glittered with possibilities, but also with the harsh realities of the work that lay before him. His mind kept replaying the events of the flight. The sharp glances, the unwarranted scrutiny, the subtle dismissals, and he couldn't shake the feeling that what had transpired on Skylux Flight 218 was more than just a personal affront. It was a symptom of a systemic issue, one that would take time and a concerted effort to change. But he was determined. The plane touched down softly on the runway, and the familiar buzz of passengers preparing to disembark filled the cabin. Ethan gathered his things slowly, his movements deliberate, as if trying to hold on to the moment before he stepped off the plane and into the world of decisions and accountability that awaited him. He had spent years climbing the ladder, rising above every obstacle that had been placed in his way. Now, though, the challenge before him was different. It wasn't just about making a profit or scaling a business. It was about dismantling a culture of elitism that had been cultivated over years, perhaps decades. As the passengers filed out of the plane, Ethan was among the last to leave. He didn't want to leave just yet, didn't want to step into the terminal and begin what would surely be a whirlwind of conversations, meetings, and decisions. But there was no turning back now. His company had a responsibility to its customers, its employees, and its future to be better than this. He couldn't just let it slide. Skylux Air had to be transformed from the inside out, starting with the core values that drove its operations. When Ethan reached the terminal, he felt a familiar rush of anticipation. The controlled chaos of JFK was a stark contrast to the calm, sterile environment he had just left behind on the plane. The crowd was buzzing with energy, the cacophony of footsteps, conversations, and announcements blending into a kind of ambient noise that felt somehow comforting. He followed the signs to baggage claim and glanced around, looking for any sign of the luxury that Skylux Air prided itself on. He knew what the company was capable of. He had seen its potential when he had decided to acquire it. But the journey to unlocking that potential would require more than just financial investment. It would take a deep cultural shift, a shift that started at the very top and radiated out to every corner of the company. Waiting for him outside the terminal was a sleek black car, the driver holding a placard with his name. Ethan nodded in acknowledgement as he approached, his mind already focused on the upcoming meeting. The car's engine purred to life as they pulled out of the airport and onto the bustling streets of New York. But despite the comfort of the ride, Ethan couldn't shake the sense of urgency that was building inside him. The drive to the Skylux Air headquarters in Manhattan felt longer than usual, the city's skyline stretching out before him as he stared out of the window. The tall buildings seemed to reach for the heavens, each one a testament to ambition and power. But Ethan's thoughts weren't on the city or its glittering towers. They were focused on the company he had just acquired, a company that had the potential to be something far greater than what it was now. The car pulled up to the front of the Skylux headquarters, a sleek, modern skyscraper that towered over the street. The building's reflective glass panels seemed to shimmer in the light, a symbol of corporate success. But Ethan knew the truth. This wasn't the company he had envisioned when he first acquired Skylux. The exterior might be shiny, but beneath the surface was a culture that needed to change. As he walked through the front doors, the familiar scent of polished wood and leather greeted him. The lobby was immaculate, the lighting warm but controlled, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and sophistication. But Ethan was no longer interested in appearances. The time for facades was over. He had a job to do, and it wasn't going to be easy. He stepped into the elevator, riding silently up to the top floor where the Skylux boardroom awaited. As the doors opened, Ethan was greeted by the familiar faces of the senior management team. The room was filled with polished suits and carefully rehearsed smiles, the kind of people who had mastered the art of maintaining a professional mask. But as Ethan walked in, he could feel the tension in the air. They knew why he was here. Margaret Steele, the sharp and poised COO of Skylux, stood at the head of the table, her eyes scanning Ethan as he took his seat. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice smooth but with an undercurrent of uncertainty, "I wasn't aware you'd be attending this meeting." Ethan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Neither was I," he said calmly, settling into his seat. "But some things can't wait." The room fell silent, the executives exchanging glances, the weight of Ethan's words settling over the group like a heavy fog. He wasn't just another investor in the room. His presence here was a message, and everyone around the table knew it. Margaret cleared her throat, glancing briefly at the other executives before speaking again. "What seems to be the issue, Mr. Brooks?" Ethan didn't waste any time. He had come here with a purpose, and he wasn't going to mince words. "I flew first class today," he began, his voice steady and controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "On Flight 218 from Los Angeles to New York." The room remained still, the executives listening intently. Margaret's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Ethan continued. "It was an unannounced inspection," he said, pausing to let the gravity of his words sink in. "And what I found was unacceptable." Gasps rippled around the table. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions ranging from surprise to unease. They hadn't expected this kind of direct confrontation, especially not so early in the morning. They had assumed that Ethan would be satisfied with the usual behind-the-scenes updates, the glossy reports, the numbers that painted a picture of success. But Ethan wasn't interested in the surface-level data. He needed to see the truth, to witness firsthand what was going on beneath the polished exterior. "I was profiled by one of your senior flight attendants," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "She questioned my right to be in first class, despite having a valid boarding pass. She did this loudly, in front of the other passengers. And when I refused to move, she escalated the situation, calling for a supervisor." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Ethan's words settling in. Margaret's face paled slightly, and she glanced at the others around the table, as if searching for an explanation, though there was none. "Who was the flight attendant?" Margaret asked, her voice tight, laced with urgency. "Lisa Carter," Ethan replied, his gaze unwavering. "But this isn't just about her. This is about something much bigger. Lisa's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a culture that allows this kind of bias to flourish." The room seemed to collectively inhale. Margaret's eyes widened, but she remained composed, scribbling something down on her notepad. The other executives exchanged uncertain glances, but Ethan could see the discomfort in their eyes. They knew he was right. This wasn't just a problem with one employee. It was a systemic issue that had infiltrated every level of the company. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes scanning the room, making sure everyone was paying attention. "I'm not here to single out Lisa," he continued. "I'm here because this company needs to change. It needs to start treating its customers and employees with respect, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or how they choose to dress. We cannot continue to operate under the assumption that a certain type of person is worthy of the first-class experience. That kind of thinking is not only wrong, it's bad business." The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan could feel the unease radiating from every corner of the table, but he wasn't backing down. He knew what needed to be done. "We're going to start by holding everyone accountable," he said, his tone firm. "Lisa will face consequences, but I want her to have the opportunity to learn. She will be given a chance to undergo diversity and inclusion training, and so will every other employee. This isn't optional. If we're going to build a culture of respect and excellence, it starts with confronting our biases." The room was still, but no one spoke out against him. Ethan could see that the executives were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. He wasn't playing games anymore. This was about change, real change, and it wasn't going to happen if they didn't take responsibility for their actions. "I also want regular audits," he continued, his voice growing more resolute. "We'll implement anonymous feedback from passengers, employees, everyone who interacts with Skylux. We'll create a system where issues like this can be addressed before they escalate, and we will hold every department accountable for fostering a culture of inclusivity." Margaret nodded slowly, her face a mix of concern and acceptance. "Understood, Mr. Brooks," she said quietly. "We'll begin implementing your recommendations immediately." Ethan didn't smile. This wasn't a victory yet. It was just the beginning. But as he looked around the room, he knew that the first step had been taken. Skylux's air would change, and he was going to make sure of it. The company that had once prided itself on exclusivity would soon be known for its commitment to equality, respect, and excellence. And he wasn't going to stop until that vision became a reality. The road to accountability. The days following Ethan's meeting with Skylux's senior management were a blur of decisions, strategy sessions, and intense conversations. As the new majority owner of the company, he felt the weight of responsibility more than ever. The room in which he had laid out his vision for Skylux's future echoed with the resolve that had built up over the years of his own journey. The harshness of his first-class experience wasn't just a personal affront. It was a catalyst for something far greater. It was the spark that would ignite the flames of reform within the company, a company that had long been trapped by outdated values of exclusivity, bias, and elitism. Ethan knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing the corporate culture of a company as established as Skylux wasn't something that could happen overnight. It required not just new policies and procedures, but a complete overhaul of the way people thought and operated within the organization. This wasn't going to be about pointing fingers or singling out individuals. It was about accountability, about creating a space where respect and dignity were non-negotiable, and where diversity wasn't just tolerated but celebrated. The first task was clear: accountability. Ethan spent the next several days reviewing the feedback from the flight attendants, supervisors, and other staff members. Lisa Carter's actions had set the stage, but Ethan knew that her behavior was merely a symptom of a larger problem. There were too many people within the company who thought they could get away with perpetuating biases because they had never been forced to confront them. This, Ethan realized, was the kind of systemic issue that had to be addressed head-on. No one could be allowed to hide behind the shield of complacency anymore. Lisa was the first employee to be brought to the table. Ethan had insisted that she be given an opportunity for redemption, but that didn't mean her actions would go unchecked. She was required to undergo mandatory sensitivity and diversity training. But Ethan didn't stop there. He paired her with a mentor, someone from outside the senior staff, someone who could offer a fresh perspective on what true hospitality looked like, someone who didn't carry the same biases that had clearly taken root within Skylux. Ethan wasn't looking for a quick fix. He wanted real, lasting change. But it wasn't just about Lisa. The company needed a cultural shift that involved everyone, from the executives at the top down to the ground crew that worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Ethan mandated that all employees, regardless of their position, undergo the same comprehensive training. And he made sure that no one was exempt, not even the senior management. Everyone had to confront their own biases, whether they were conscious or unconscious. The process was intense, and for some, it was uncomfortable. Ethan knew this. He had anticipated the resistance. Change was rarely easy, but it was necessary, and he was determined to see it through. While the training sessions were ongoing, Ethan also turned his attention to the company's internal policies. Skylux's customer service practices had been based on a hierarchy that privileged a certain kind of passenger, one that looked a certain way, dressed a certain way, and acted a certain way. It wasn't just first class that needed reform. Every aspect of the customer experience needed to reflect a more inclusive mindset. Ethan commissioned a full audit of Skylux's service offerings, from booking to in-flight experiences, to identify where these biases were most prevalent. As he read through the results of the audit, it became clear that the issue wasn't just limited to the flight attendants. The entire airline, from the reservation system to the lounges, had been built around an idealized image of who was worthy of its best offerings. The language used in the customer service scripts, the assumptions made about passenger profiles, even the way amenities were offered, all of it reflected a culture that catered to a narrow, often exclusive demographic. The lack of diversity in Skylux's advertising campaigns and promotional materials was another glaring example of the company's failure to acknowledge the full breadth of its potential customer base. Ethan knew that fixing these issues would take time, but he also understood the importance of setting an example. He wanted Skylux to become a company that didn't just cater to the privileged few, but served everyone with the same level of respect, no matter their background, race, or social standing. Skylux's first-class service would be the pinnacle of what the airline could offer, but the airline would no longer reserve that level of treatment for only a select group of people. Every passenger, regardless of their ticket class, would be treated with dignity, professionalism, and care. With these changes in motion, Ethan found himself more focused than ever. His resolve had been tempered by his experiences, by the prejudices he had faced growing up, by the lessons he had learned through hard work, and by the realization that he couldn't just sit idly by and allow the status quo to continue. He had the power to reshape Skylux Air into something that stood for more than just luxury and exclusivity. It would become a beacon of change in an industry that had long been plagued by biases. Despite the urgency of the moment, Ethan wasn't blind to the resistance that had begun to surface. He had known it would happen. After all, change was never easy, especially when it came to deep-rooted beliefs and practices. He had already heard murmurs from some of the senior staff who felt that the changes were unnecessary, that Skylux had been operating just fine without the need to make these sweeping reforms. But Ethan wasn't concerned about short-term pushback. He knew that time would prove him right. Those who resisted would either fall in line or be left behind. One afternoon, after the mandatory training sessions had begun, Ethan sat down with Margaret Steele, the COO. He had always respected her sharp mind and strategic thinking, but their recent conversations had left him unsettled. While Margaret had outwardly supported the cultural shift he was trying to instill, he couldn't help but sense a hesitance in her, something that suggested she wasn't fully committed to the kind of change that was required. "Margaret," Ethan said, his voice calm but serious, "I need you to understand that this is bigger than just a training session. This is a complete shift in how we operate. If we're going to change the culture at Skylux, we all have to lead by example. I need you to be fully invested in this." Margaret met his gaze, her eyes unwavering, but there was something unreadable in her expression. She didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to take a long pause before speaking. "I do understand, Ethan," she said, her tone careful. "But I've been in this industry long enough to know that not everyone will embrace these changes. Some people will resist, no matter how much we push, and that includes the people in this very room." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. "I'm not here to make friends, Margaret. I'm here to make Skylux better. And that means we can't let resistance stop us. If people aren't willing to change, then they won't be part of Skylux's future. It's as simple as that." Margaret's eyes flickered for just a moment, and then she nodded slowly. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. But this is going to be a long road, Ethan." Ethan smiled, a quiet, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "It's a road we have to take, and I'm not backing down." As the days turned into weeks, Ethan saw the changes starting to take root. The resistance, while still present, began to quiet down as employees recognized that this wasn't a passing trend, it was a movement. The training sessions continued, and employees from every department began to share their experiences, their frustrations, and their hopes for a more inclusive workplace. Ethan sat in on some of the sessions, listening intently as staff members spoke openly about their struggles and the biases they had witnessed or even internalized over the years. It was a difficult process, but Ethan remained resolute. He had learned long ago that real change came from confronting uncomfortable truths, and that was exactly what he was doing at Skylux. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the problems. It was about actively working to dismantle the systems that perpetuated inequality. And so, Skylux began to change. The subtle shifts were first. Employees who had once been hesitant now took the lead in advocating for inclusivity. The language used in customer service scripts changed to reflect a more diverse and welcoming tone. Skylux's marketing campaigns, once homogeneous, began to feature individuals from a variety of backgrounds, showcasing a wider range of experiences and voices. The first-class service, while still exceptional, began to feel less like an exclusive club and more like a reflection of the respect every customer deserved. It was just the beginning, but for Ethan, it was enough to know that they were on the right path. The hard work was far from over, but the first steps had been taken. And that was all that mattered. Facing the backlash, the momentum that had built in Skylux Air over the past few months was palpable. Ethan's reforms were beginning to take root, slowly but steadily. The resistance that had initially flared up within certain corners of the company was slowly being whittled away. People were starting to understand that this wasn't just about a few policy changes or a rebranding effort. It was about transforming the entire culture of the company. However, despite the progress, not all was smooth sailing. Change, as Ethan had always known, wasn't just met with enthusiasm and applause. In fact, it often came with its fair share of backlash, and as Skylux Air's transformation began to take shape, Ethan realized that the road to true cultural change was going to be far more challenging than he had initially anticipated. One afternoon, as Ethan was sitting in his office overlooking the city, reviewing the latest reports on employee engagement and customer satisfaction, a sudden knock on his door broke his concentration. Margaret Steele entered, her expression serious and her posture slightly tense. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Ethan stood up immediately, sensing the urgency in her tone. "What's going on?" Margaret closed the door behind her and walked over to his desk, where she stood for a moment, seemingly weighing her words. "It's about the changes you've been pushing for, particularly the new diversity and inclusion policies. Some of the senior executives are starting to get nervous. There's been talk about the direction of the company, and some of them aren't exactly happy with where things are going." Ethan furrowed his brow, leaning forward. He had anticipated some pushback, but he hadn't expected it to be this pronounced. "Are they talking about the new training programs? The employee feedback systems?" "It's more than that," Margaret said, her voice dropping even lower. "There's been an undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the overall approach. Some people feel that the changes are too radical, that they go against the very essence of what Skylux represents. They believe that these policies are alienating longtime clients and core customers who aren't necessarily looking for the kinds of inclusivity we're advocating." Ethan felt a sharp pang of frustration, but he quickly masked it. "Are they worried about their bonuses? About the impact on short-term profits?" Margaret hesitated but then nodded. "Yes, a lot of these executives have been with the company for decades. They've built their careers on the same foundations we're trying to change, and for some of them, this feels like a direct threat to their livelihoods. There's a concern that this push for inclusivity and equality might drive away the high-end clientele that Skylux is known for." Ethan paused, absorbing the information. He could feel the weight of it, the pressure that was beginning to mount on all sides. He had expected resistance from the rank and file, but not from the very executives who should have been the most invested in the future of Skylux. These were the people who had helped build the company into the powerhouse it had become, and now they were questioning the very vision that would secure its future. But Ethan wasn't going to back down. He knew what had to be done. He had spent years fighting for equality, for respect, and for inclusion in his own career. This wasn't just a business decision. It was a moral one. He had made a commitment to Skylux's employees and customers, and he wasn't about to let the company's legacy be defined by exclusion. "I don't care if it's uncomfortable," Ethan said, his voice firm. "This change is happening, and it's happening now. The culture of Skylux Air needs to evolve, whether they like it or not. We're not just going to cater to the rich and powerful. We're going to set a new standard for the entire industry." Margaret met his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. "I agree, Ethan, but we need to find a way to bring them on board. We can't alienate the very people who have supported this company all these years. We need to show them that this change doesn't mean abandoning our core values. It means expanding them. We can still be a premium airline without turning our back on inclusivity." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind already racing with possible strategies. "You're right. We need to find a balance. I'll speak with the senior executives personally. I'll make it clear that inclusivity doesn't mean lowering our standards. It means raising the bar for how we treat every single person who interacts with this company. Our commitment to luxury, to exceptional service, has always been about making people feel valued. We're just broadening that definition." Margaret looked at him for a moment before nodding in agreement. "I'll schedule a meeting with the executive team. They'll need to hear this from you directly." As the days passed, Ethan worked tirelessly to address the growing unrest among Skylux's senior leadership. He spent hours crafting a message that would resonate with those who were feeling threatened by the company's new direction. He knew he couldn't afford to alienate the very people who had helped build Skylux's success, but he also couldn't allow them to undermine the changes that were necessary for the future of the company. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. It would be a pivotal moment for Skylux, a chance for Ethan to confront the resistance head-on and make it clear where he stood. As the day approached, he spent hours rehearsing his speech, carefully choosing every word. He knew this wasn't just about convincing the executives. It was about ensuring they understood the broader vision, the long-term benefits of embracing inclusivity and diversity, and how it would ultimately elevate Skylux to a new level of excellence. On the morning of the meeting, Ethan walked into the sleek, glass-walled boardroom, his posture straight, his demeanor calm but resolute. The senior executives were already seated around the polished table, their faces a mixture of anticipation and skepticism. Margaret had briefed him on their concerns, and now it was time to address them directly. "Good morning, everyone," Ethan said, his voice carrying authority as he addressed the group. "I'm sure you've all heard the concerns that have been raised about the direction Skylux is heading in, and I understand the hesitation. Change is hard. But what I want you to understand today is that the future of this company depends on us evolving, on us adapting to a world that is changing rapidly." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "For too long, we've operated under a system that prioritizes a narrow definition of luxury. We've catered to the elite few, the ones who fit a specific mold, and in doing so, we've ignored a vast and growing demographic that deserves to be treated with the same level of respect and excellence. Our customers, our employees, they are not just numbers or dollar signs. They are people, and we need to start seeing them that way." Ethan could see the skepticism in the eyes of some of the executives, but he pressed on. "I know that the changes we're implementing aren't easy. I know that some of you are concerned about the potential fallout, about losing clients or alienating customers. But let me be clear, inclusivity does not mean sacrificing our standards. It means raising the bar for how we treat every person who walks through our doors, no matter their background, their race, their socioeconomic status. This is about creating a culture of respect, one that attracts customers because they know we care about them as individuals, not as statistics." There was a long silence in the room. Ethan could feel the tension, but he refused to back down. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let fear or resistance hold him back now. One of the executives, a senior vice president named Alan, spoke up, his voice cautious but firm. "Ethan, I understand the sentiment. But we've built this brand on exclusivity. Our clients expect the very best, and they've come to associate Skylux with a certain level of prestige. If we start offering the same level of service to everyone, won't that dilute the experience?" Ethan shook his head. "No, Alan. It will make it better. What we've been offering has always been about exceptional service, about making people feel valued. Why should that be exclusive? Why can't the same level of respect and excellence apply to everyone who flies with us? This is about setting a new standard for luxury, one that includes every person, not just those who fit a certain mold. And when we do this right, We will not only retain our current clientele, we will expand it. The world is changing, and Skylux needs to change with it. There was another long silence as the executives exchanged glances, but this time there was a sense of quiet understanding in the air. The seed had been planted. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more hurdles to overcome. But for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of recognition in their eyes. They understood. They might not fully agree, but they understood. As the meeting ended, Ethan felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. The battle wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, and not everyone would be on board with the new direction. But for the first time since he had taken over Skylux, he felt like they were truly on the path to change. And that, he realized, was all that mattered.